Should I help you?
Feel free. Should we stand up? That's easier. The other way?
Yeah.
Do you need airplane mode? Is it okay?
No, it's okay.
Okay.
And
In the pocket?
yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thanks. It's okay. It doesn't matter.
Thanks.
All right.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jean-Christophe Bas. I'm the CEO of the Dialogue of Civilization Institute. I would like to welcome everyone to this lecture that is part of our series Meet in Mitte that was created about a year ago. And I think this week is a very special week. Everybody, and particularly here in Berlin, you know, we see with all the official limousine and with the big traffic jam in the city that there is very special happening. You know, we are indeed celebrating the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it is a very special time, and it's also a very unique moment in time to think about the state of the world today, the state of the world order, the state of the world disorder, how the world has evolved during those past 30 years. And I think there is probably no better time, you know, to discuss what we will be discussing tonight with Professor Cocker, you know, this rise of the civilization state. You will tell us what means exactly in your mind this notion of civilization state, but evidently we have moved from a world where, let's say, the dividing line was very much between ideology, and now we are heading towards a world where the dividing line is between identity and no longer between ideology, and where, in a way, as you say very rightly, it's where civilization and culture is becoming the major currency in foreign policy and international affairs. So we are very pleased to have tonight with us Professor Christopher Cocker, who is the director of LSE IDEAS, you know, which is the think tank of the London School of Economics. And Professor Cocker is a well-established expert on wars and conflict, and I think it will be interesting that you will also tell us that the book that you wrote in 2015 about the improbable war, and that's called Improbable War, China, the US, and the Logic of the Great Power. Is it still improbable, or does it now becoming more probable? And so you are also, among many other, you know, you have been a fellow of NATO, and being involved with many major projects and academic projects related to topic of peace around the world. So this is really a great chance to have you today. You were also very involved just 2 weeks ago, and I want also to take this opportunity to say a few words about the Dialogue of Civilization Institute. We just had 3 weeks ago in Rhodos in Greece, the 17th edition of our annual forum. And for those of you, you know, who are not familiar and who have not been involved with DOC so far, I really encourage you to look at the website, you know, some of the videos and the debates, you know, that were extremely vibrant. DOC is a unique platform of dialogue and interaction between the Western world and the emerging world in order to try together in a non-confrontational way and in a constructive spirit to try to find common ground and to shape together a sustainable and a peaceful world. So we are really welcoming everyone to be involved in a regular basis with the work and the activities of Dialogue of Civilization. Professor Cocker, you have the floor, and again, thanks a lot for making time to join us tonight.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the invitation, your kind remarks. I will speak for about 40 minutes and then open it up to question and answer. So, you were kind enough to quote me in my book as one of the opening statements that culture has become the currency of power in a way that ideology was the currency of power during the Cold War. I'm just going to give you a few snapshots of this. And they're all actually rather confrontational, I'm afraid to say, because my living has been talking to organizations like NATO, where you always think in adversarial terms. This particular institute is committed to dialogue of civilizations, and that's something that goes back. Well, when was the Dialogue of Civilizations first thought of as a United Nations proposal? It was Havel and Khatami, I think, many years ago. There was a year of the Dialogue of Civilizations, I seem to recall, at the United Nations. So what I'm saying is a little negative, because that's negativity is what I deal with. You may want to open it up to the positive aspects of this. Russia, Vladimir Putin last year saying that there was now a civilizational schism between the West and Russia. Not an ideological schism, but a civilizational one. Viktor Orban saying that Europe is now divided in two between those members of the European Union who are Christian and those members of the European Union who are semi-Islamic. Macron saying last year that there is a civilizational chasm between Europe and Africa. He was referring to what he calls the demographic time bomb of migration from Africa, that we need to stop this demographic move. The leader of Vox in Spain, you may have seen him recently on a horse, trying to rekindle memories of the Reconquista in Spain, the reconquest by the Christian powers against Moorish Spain. You have the Jobbik party in Hungary saying that the values of the European Union, the liberal values, are completely alien to the Hungarian people because they're against its Magyar genetic stock. In other words, Hungarians are Asians, they're not Europeans, and it's sooner or later the Hungarians will wake up to this. Abe in Japan, perhaps the closest ally that Donald Trump has in the world, a man who's gone out of his way to try to like Donald Trump in a way that Macron and others, perhaps as you've heard Macron's comments today, not necessarily the case, saying that he's very worried about the Americanization of Japan and the need to rejuvenate Japanese culture and put it back in touch with what was Japanese before the Second World War. And in India, of course, Narendra Modi, we have a man who's rewriting the history books in Gujarat, his own home state, talking about the Muslim occupation in the 7th centuries in which a number of different Islamic powers were involved in India, and a huge statue of Shivaji, who is a famous Hindu resistance leader from the 1670s, the tallest statue in the world. What is going on here? Because international relations professors such as myself don't deal in snapshots, we deal in patterns. So the first is that the language, adversarial or not, of international politics is increasingly culture. The second is that I think there is a geopolitical fault line now running across the world, and it's a cultural fault line, which pits in particular Russia and China, who identify themselves as civilization states, against the United States and the West. And the third is that the liberal world order that we all talk about, we often talk about the rules of the system, but it's also the values of the system, because I think there's a pushback against the idea that there are such things as universal values. But that's a Western story that Westerners have told themselves since the European Enlightenment, perhaps even earlier, and that we should get used to a world of value pluralism, in which there will be different value sets which are based on different civilizational histories. So that's why we're talking about it today. The West versus the rest, you may think that this was a concept dreamt up by the famous Harvard professor Samuel Huntington. It wasn't. It was coined in 1992 by Kishore Mahbubani, later a Singaporean ambassador to the United Nations, who said back in the 1990s, with unipolarity and the end of the Cold War, the West was going to impose itself on the rest and try to westernize it in a variety of projects such as nation building, democracy promotion, what we got used to calling regime change, of course, after 2001. Today, Mahbubani says it's the other way around now. It's the West versus the West, and not before time. He's the author of a book called Has the West Lost It? I don't need to tell you what the conclusion he reaches. The title itself will tell you. The conclusion is that the West has lost it. This is the end of the Western moment in history, and we will be looking at a civilizational history that basically has been airbrushed out of the account. So, for example, when I read at university, when I read history in the early 1970s, we didn't do global history. We weren't told about the history of China. We weren't told about the history of India. British India, yes, but not of India, which goes back 2,000 or 3,000 years. Today, you can't write a history of the world which isn't a global history, and you can't even write a history of the Roman Empire, for example, unless you're looking at the links through the Great Silk Road, hence the importance of that. Peter Frankopan book. Frankopan himself has had 1 or 2 meetings with Xi Jinping. History is coming back. So the idea that the rest of the world was airbrushed out of historical accounts is being challenged. Does this put you in mind of Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations? All those little snapshots I gave you, all confrontational comments by leaders for one reason or another. Does this put you in mind of the Clash of Civilizations? Well, Gideon Rachman, a Financial Times columnist, said after the Charlie Hebdo attack in Paris, unfortunately, whenever you read of a terrorist attack anywhere, or whenever you read, for example, of Christians being targeted in the Middle East, or Hindus being targeted in Bangladesh, or these days Uyghurs being targeted in China, or Tibetans, you think immediately of a clash of civilizations. Samuel Huntington put it into our minds, and it's still there 40 years later. And I remind you that Huntington was actually arguing that identity politics was going to become important. Identities were going to define people. He wrote a book about identity politics in his own country. It was his very last book, Who Are We?, shortly before he died. And I think Huntington is still read now. His book has been translated in 60 different languages. It's still on the syllabus. It's the most important book in international relations that has been written since the end of the Cold War, because a lot of people buy into the idea, and even if you don't buy into the idea, and I certainly don't buy into the idea, it's there in the forefront, or at least in the back of your mind. But he was ahead of the game simply because he got history right. The importance of what happened in 1979. And of course, this month, today, you are in this part of the world, particularly in Berlin, remembering the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was 30 years ago. But I think when historians of the future look back, they'll say that the defining moment was not the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War and communism. It was what happened 10 years earlier, in 1979, the Iranian Revolution, which changed the landscape of the Middle East permanently and brought religion to the fore as a factor in international politics, and China, of course, which raised the whole point about Asian values, if you remember that debate in the 1980s, the Asian century, and again, the end of the Western moment. I think historians will see 1989 as the end of a phase of history. They will look at 1979 as the beginning of a new phase. And then globalization, which, as you know, has amplified cultural differences as people try to defend themselves against these economic and other forces and cultural homogenization, which nobody really likes. They find their identities again or rediscover them. And then there is the Trump administration, which partly buys, I think, into the Clash of Civilizations. Thesis I've quoted here, Karen Skinner, Director of Policy Planning. This is the first time the US has faced a great power competitor that is not Caucasian. She said in that speech that the Cold War was a war within the Western family, because Marxism was a Western ideology, and the Soviet Union was, to a certain extent, a Western country, at least a European country. Now, she says, we're facing a non-Western competitor. She forgets Imperial Japan in 1941, which, by the way, I argue is my book, is the first civilization state, that deliberately defined itself as a civilization state, partly because it was so concerned about westernization and losing its identity. So what is a civilization? If I were talking to a bunch of anthropologists in the West, I would have difficulty because anthropologists don't like the term civilization any more than in the 1960s they liked the term tribe. So let's put anthropologists to one side because historians do like the word civilization, and many of them spend their lives writing about ancient civilizations which have been around, some are still around today. If you accept the term, I would go with Peter Sorokin, who was a Russian, American Russian in the 1920s, who said that a civilization is a system. Now, we're familiar today with the term system, biosystems, ecosystems, solar systems. It's actually very new and rather radical in the 1920s to use this term system. It's a system made up of interconnected parts. It's a system made up of different cultural styles, different behavioral patterns, different social units, and different imaginations. So if we take Western civilization, for example, we would say that the defining mark of Western civilization in the 19th century was the nation-state. Western civilization invented the nation-state as we understand it today. It goes back early, of course, to the 19th century. Cultural styles, architectural styles, you know that you're in a European city from the Rococo or the Baroque or the Neoclassical, it's instantaneous. Similarly, you know, in Japan or in China or India, where you are from these architectural styles. The pattern of behavior in 19th century Europe was international law, which had been conceived in its present state in the 18th century and institutionalized and codified in the 19th century. This is how states were supposed to behave. The tribute system in China, the Sinosphere, if you wish to call it that, was very, very different. It was a kind of contractual relationship, but a very different one. The governing principles, and this is the important thing with Sorokin, is that there is always at any one time a dominant attitude towards the nature of ultimate reality. You can call it a worldview, you can call it a sociocultural world, you can call it a social imaginary. The dominant Western idea at the beginning of the 20th century was that history was made by two forces. It was made by the market, and it was also basically about the fight for freedom. Or as Hegel famously said, freedom becoming conscious of itself. It's when you become self-conscious about freedom that you actually make your progress. Democracy is not necessarily the key word here, but the fight for freedom, which came in, of course, with the Enlightenment and the Revolution and everything else. And this created what Donald Tusk, 2 years ago, called a political civilization, which was unique. We call it the West today. It's the first time I've heard of the term political civilization. He used it because he was concerned, as he said in the speech in which he used it, he was concerned that Donald Trump's election and Brexit would be the beginning of the end of Western political civilization. But as a project, this basically is what the West has been about. And it's involved two social imaginaries which have made the Western agenda. One was liberal internationalism, that we associate specifically with Woodrow Wilson, and the other cosmopolitanism, which we associate with the European Union and which is deemed to derive from Immanuel Kant. I'll just give you an example of liberal internationalism because it wasn't an American invention, it was a British invention. And the date, which is the defining date, is 1856, the Second Opium War, and a debate which took place in the House of Commons on the second day of the war. It was a motion of no confidence tabled by the Conservative Party that was then in opposition in Parliament against the Liberal government of the day on the grounds that it was outrageous to go to war for a principle. The principle here was free trade, that the only way in which you could go to war, the only reason to go to war, was for a very closely defined national interest, or something like the balance of power, for example. What I think we're seeing here is a kind of argument that the Liberal government made was, with open borders, go open minds. People become open to Western ideas. And with open minds comes what we would today call an open society. And there was a journalist covering this debate for the New York Daily Tribune who wrote about it, and 2 days later his Americans were reading about it, in which he said he'd seen the future. That Britain, and he said every Western country would follow, going to war for a principle, holding the moral high ground, being in the having the moral right on your side. And he said there would be absolutely no end to the wars that these Western countries would now fight. His name was Karl Marx. 1856, Woodrow Wilson, of course, taking his country into a war in 1917 to make the world safe for democracy. Every American leader taking his country to war to create a new world order, with the exception of George W. Bush in 2001, where he was talking about managing the global disorder, which would remain for the lifetime of Americans and possibly their own children. Well, liberal internationalism is now dead, partly because Donald Trump has no belief in it, has no belief in human rights projection or democracy projection. There's no one to actually carry it. And in Britain, it's been discredited, of course, by our connection with the Iraq War. I don't see it coming back. So liberal internationalism as a social imaginary, I think, is pretty much gone. And Kantian cosmopolitanism, well, yes, it's associated with the European Union, but if you look very closely at the global strategy of 2016, you'll see that the European Union has reined in its ambition. So now the talk is of principle pragmatism. One must have principles, but one must be very pragmatic in their expression. The idea of democracy promotion, yes, but only be very realistic. We know that a country like Belarus isn't going to be democratic anytime soon. And generally, I think, the European Union has lost interest in this cosmopolitan project that was so important to it in the 1990s, particularly its intervention in the Balkans. So Western political civilization is in trouble. And when people talk, and at the conference I'm attending at the moment, just down the road, we will have a session tomorrow on how critical is the crisis in the West. If I were attending that session or speaking at that session, I would say it's critical because Western political civilization is now in crisis. That doesn't mean the end of the West or the decline of the West or anything like that at all, but it does mean perhaps that we're seeing a reconfiguration of international politics. This brings me to the civilization state. Two countries claim to be civilization states. They are celebrating their civilization at a time that the West finds it very difficult to do so for a number of reasons we can go into if you like. One is China, that declared itself a civilization state, or rather Xi Jinping did in the 19th Party Congress, and the other, of course, is Russia, where Vladimir Putin declared Russia to be a civilization state in the Valdai meeting in 2013, and this has got general traction. India, if Narendra Modi had his way, would be a civilization state. It's very difficult for him to achieve that. We can go into that if we wish. Turkey is on the way to becoming a civilization state under Erdogan. And that indeed is part of its move from the West, its de-Westernization, which is now going on. So what is a civilization state? And let's turn to China. I mentioned wolf totem at the very beginning because a civilization state, there are two concepts, I think, in China. One is a nationalist concept, and the other is more the government's idea of what it would like China to be. Just by way of the nationalist concept, Wolf Totem was a book that was published in 2006 in China. It sold more copies than any other book in the history of China, except for Chairman Mao's Little Red Book, which was compulsory reading, of course, in the 1960s. It's been translated. A film version has been made of it. It's very popular in the Western world, particularly in Germany, by the way, because it seemed to have an ecological and environmental message. It's all about how you're dealing with an ecosystem up in the north, of how the author, who'd been condemned during the Cultural Revolution and found himself in exile in Outer Mongolia, he saw what industrialization, pollution, environmental degradation was doing. So it's a very eco-friendly book. Unfortunately, in the translations that you find in the West, you won't find the epilogue. And the epilogue actually is a genetic history of China, a very brief genetic history of China. And basically, the Chinese have two sets of genes, Han genes, which come from the indigenous Chinese people, and Tata genes that come from the tribes, nomadic tribes, that invaded and on two occasions conquered China over about a 3,000-year period. And that China is very privileged to have this genetic makeup, because the Han genes make it capitalist. You know, who invented capitalism? Traders in China thousands of years ago, effectively. But the Tata genes make the Chinese strong, not to be messed around with. So that is one of the reasons why Wolf Totem is a popular book in the Chinese military, by the way, the PLA. It's something that they like the world to know we are a strong nation, don't mess with us. This is not the government's view of what a civilization state is. So there is no reference to genes or genetic inheritance. Though it's quite interesting, by the way, that in the Maoist period there was an attempt to prove that the Chinese were directly descended from Homo erectus and were not actually a major part of Homo sapiens. In other words, that they were older than Homo sapiens. But this attempt failed because the scientists simply couldn't find any genetic proof of this. So that's fortunate that we're not listening to that particular tale. Ren, the theory of all under heaven, just means that the Chinese concept of harmony, which you find expressed both in Confucianism and Taoism, particularly in Taoism, is about the collective well-being, collective responsibility, human sympathy, sympathy for the community, not unbridled individualism, not an unbridled marketplace, but basically a place where people are encouraged to live in harmony with each other. So this is an implicit model. This is our model, and it differs from the Western model. So don't give us lectures on individualism and individual rights, because look at what you have created as a result of that. Each person screwing the other over for a percentage. The patriotic history courses is about essentially our civilization being the most important civilization. The tribute system was based on the understanding that China was the acme of civilization. There wasn't any greater in the world. And this is the problem when the British and French came along. It wasn't that they defeated Chinese armies. Chinese armies have been defeated plenty of times, and China's been occupied by nomadic tribes at least twice, as I said. It's that these people were different from the nomads who came across the Great Wall. Nomads who came across the Great Wall became Chinese within a few generations because they recognized the superiority of Chinese civilization. These nomads who came by sea, not on horseback but on ship, were nomads who rejected the superiority of Chinese civilization and actually had the temerity to say, our civilization is superior to yours. This was a shock. And that is what makes the 19th century the century of humiliation. It's what one Chinese scholar calls an ontological rupture in the view that one has of oneself. And therefore, I think, this is the reason why there are 428 patriotic history sites which Chinese children are taken to. This is the reason why there are patriotic history courses. And the implicit message in all of this is that we are returning to an age where our civilization is superior. Now, countering that is also the idea that we're not an imperial country like these Europeans. We have no mission to make the rest of the world Chinese, because if you are the superior civilization by definition, you have to be Chinese to be part of that civilization. We don't expect to have protectorates and colonies. And actually, the argument is, even in the tribute system, we gave, we didn't take. So these Europeans would take slaves, they'd take gold, they would loot countries. What we did was we gave people what they didn't have, which in the early days of the tribute system was silk, which was only produced in China. We gave more than we took. In fact, we took hardly anything from the tributary countries except respect. They had to recognize the superiority of our civilization. If they did that twice a year by coming to the capital and kowtowing to the emperor, that was fine. So that's, quite an easy imperialist system, cultural imperialism, rather than military imperialism or economic imperialism. And that would be a defense of Chinese history against the horrible story of Western history. Xi Jinping talks about harmony with difference. And it's very interesting. He has now identified Europeans as being the partners of China, not the United States. And he makes this plain in many of his speeches, that there is a difference, because Europe is the home of Western civilization. It begins in ancient Greece. America is a young country that has been around for less than 300 years and insultingly wants to Americanize the world. that it's not even a Western project, it's an American project, and that the Europeans should be aware of that fact as well, and their natural partner should be China, not actually the United States, in a world in which civilizations have mutual respect for one another. This brings me to China's alternative world view, which is that civilizations should respect one another. Civilizations should not deem to have views on what you do with the Uyghurs or Tibetans any more than you have views on how you should deal with migrants coming from Africa over the Mediterranean. Privileged civilizational spheres of interest, yes, because I think the Chinese government would like to restore the tribute system if it possibly can. An end of universalism, yes, as well. You'll find all of this in a number of speeches. One of the earliest is 1997, a joint communique between the Russian and Chinese governments about how to create a new international order. It's one of the first instances where they rejected the idea of universalism. And another Xi Jinping speech to UNESCO in 2014. And another Xi Jinping's address to the United Nations General Assembly. It's all there. The important thing, I think, is that, again, China says that don't criticize us because we're against universal values. Because unlike the West, we don't have coalition rule warfare, we don't do alliances, we don't have military bases around the world. That's no longer actually true. We have partnerships. And this is what the whole Belt and Road Initiative is based about. A world of partnerships in which partners work in what's called communities of common destiny. But a community of common destiny is based on interests and not values. And the idea is that world peace is based not on making people like each other and not on making people similar to each other, but on people recognizing that their mutual interest is peace and coexistence. So this is an attempt to really change the terms of the debate. Let me move on to Russia. The Russian civilization state idea is based on a number of factors. One is that Russia is a Eurasian country. Eurasian means being half Asian and half European. It's very specific. It makes Russia different from China, which is most certainly Asian, and doesn't deny the fact. Xi Jinping now aspires to talk for Asia as the oldest Asian civilization. In fact, historically, India is older than China, but anyway, China now claims to speak for Asia. The Europeans speak for the West, for Europe, but Russia says it's half and half. This is important because it goes back to an old debate about passionarity. This is a term that Putin started using in his speeches. It's associated with Eurasianists in the 1920s and 30s who were actually attacking communism for being non-Russian and a Western import and saying that Russia was Eurasian. But it's the idea that you absorb biochemical energy from the land and that Eurasia is, in that sense, a biochemical factory that makes you think Russian and be Russian. It's been replaced by a number of academic terms, topogenesis and place development. There are courses now taught in Russian universities about this principle. It's very Spenglerian because Spengler thought of societies and cultures as organisms, biological organisms. That's important. Another is the history debate in Russia. There's a big debate now between liberal historians who look back to Peter the Great as the founder of the Russia we know today, and historians who look back to the Tatar period as the great period of Russian history, a period that was largely airbrushed out in the last 300 years of Russian history as being slightly embarrassing. Now the Tatars are getting a good write-up as having contributed to a version of Russia that makes it distinctively non-Western. There are more disturbing, I leave that debate to Russian historians because I'm not one myself. More disturbing is how the Great Patriotic War is now being rewritten and remembered as a war not against Germany or a war against Nazism, and that's how it was depicted during the Cold War, but as a war against the West. The idea that fascism is a totally Western development, which is not, in fact, entirely untrue, and that the West and Nazi Germany are really pretty similar, to be frank. That, I think, is unhelpful, and it goes together with the rediscovery of Stalin as one of the great figures of Russian history. And then there is the National Security Strategy of 2009, which is extremely important because it has the cultural distinction, the dignity of the Russian people, that the Russian military exists to maintain the dignity of the Russian people. That means the Russian diaspora, the Russian populations in the Baltic states, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, they also are of importance to Russia as a civilizational state because they are part of Russian civilization. The cultural unity of the Russian people is also there as well, as Vladimir Putin says in his press conferences quite often. Isn't it amazing that in China, all the Chinese basically, although you have a Chinese diaspora in China, all the Americans are in America, all the Europeans are in Europe, but we Russians are divided as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union and what happened following that collapse, which of course he says is one of the great strategic geopolitical disasters of the 20th century. Historical mistakes, that's also written, the need to correct historical mistakes. One of the historical mistakes, of course, was an own goal giving Crimea to Ukraine in 1953, but that has been corrected. And the spiritual security of the Russian people. I only mention all of this because it's the language of culture, and it's interesting that it's actually in a national security doctrine. And then there, of course, was Medvedev's remark when he was president of Russia, that we are creating a zone of privileged civilizational interest. So concepts like the near abroad went, and in came a zone of privileged civilizational interest. So what's the big picture as I come to an end? And I think it's an important picture. I have painted the negative side of all of this. The dialogue of civilizations is the positive side, but part of it is to ensure that governments don't Shanghai the concept, and part of it is to ensure that you actually are talking about the same thing when you're talking about civilizational values. I think the real danger of this is captured in Ian Bremmer, his idea of a G0 world. Because if you live in a world in which civilizations have peaceful coexistence between one another, you may find yourself living in a world without global governance. You may find yourself living in a world in which the nation state has indeed been sidelined to some extent. But it's a G0 world because the idea of global civil society is meaningless. And the West no longer speaks for history or anyone but only for itself. That perhaps is already happening, and that perhaps is inevitable. I suppose the bottom line, and my concern, is this, that if you don't have a concept of public goods, what do you have for global governance? Now, it just so happens that the West, in a sense, invented the concept of public goods in the course of the 19th century. Joseph Nye quite recently said that the United States seems unwilling to want to share its public goods with anyone else. And for him, as an American, that's the major challenge that he faces. But I don't see any public goods at the moment emerging from the civilization state. And that is of concern to me. I'm going to end here and would be very happy. I think, Richard, you are going to come up with some comments.
Thank you, Professor Cocker, for this very thoughtful and inspiring historical but also contemporary perspective. It is, as we said, very timely to discuss that, and there are many things that will we will get back and keep this idea of this G0 world, and I think this is something that, of course, we will be discussing. But before we open the floor, I would like to give an opportunity to Professor Richard Egot to make a first comment. And the reason why I would like him to, is that he has produced this very interesting report that I would like everyone, to suggest everyone to read, that is called Civilization, State and World Order, Where Are We, Where Are We Heading? And this report was produced for the 17th edition of the Rhodos Forum. I think there are lots of elements of either response of dialogue with what you just mentioned. So Richard, maybe in a few minutes, you would be welcome to comment, and then we will open the discussion.
Okay, if I stand here, everyone can hear me, can't they?
But come to the light. And before you come here, I would like also to mention that we are also connected tonight with the DOC office in Moscow. So I would like to welcome colleagues and also visitors and participants from Moscow. I know it's quite late, because you are 2 hours ahead of Berlin, but you are most welcome to participate in the discussion. So if there is any remark or question or comment you want to make, please let us know. But for now, the floor is with Richard Egot.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jean-Christophe. Let me start by saying I feel a bit of a fraud, actually, commenting on Chris's work. I wrote this report, admittedly, but if we're looking for influences on this discussion about the civilization state, then it's clearly Chris and some other colleagues of ours who have taken it forward. And I've got 2 or 3 comments that I want to make and a couple of questions. The first one is on the currencies of power, because one of the things that, when I wrote the report for DOC, I identified what I called 3 problematics for explaining world order. And the 2 that we traditionally worked with was the geopolitical problematic and, of course, the geoeconomic problematic. So for this report, I added a 3rd problematic, which I called the geocultural, geocivilizational. Now, my question, given that you're quite right to identify this process, is there aren't many good things about growing old, as you know, but one of them is if you hang around long enough, things tend to come around a 2nd or a 3rd time, especially concepts in social science. And so my question is, in terms of a trend and the growth of this currency of power, I mean, are we destined to be stuck with this becoming a more increasingly prominent element of the wider strategic discourse? Or will a balance re-emerge between economics and politics, particularly, for example, when we begin to understand that you can't put the globalization genie back in the bottle? So that's really my first general comment. The second comment I want to make, and again, this turns into a question. The thing I love about your presentation and the thing I like about your book is it has you know as well as I do nowadays, that the younger generation in our discipline, if they refer to you as empirical or writing a narrative, it tends to be insulting, because it's not high theory. I say this to you as a real compliment. The thing that's important about your work is it's got a narrative. It does look at China and Russia and Turkey, and it actually speaks about them and the contributions that they are making to this process. So my question that comes out of it is much more what I call a modern-day international relations scholar. What does all this imply, this deep historical insight, what does it imply for what we might call the contemporary big-ticket items in international relations now, particularly the US-China relationship? And I wrote one line down of yours, which was a good one, where you said that, I've lost it, fragility, where are we? Can't read my own writing. Oh yes, I've got it. It's outrageous to go to war on a principle. The comment, I forget who it was from, who you mentioned. So if we take that as a yardstick, then I'm assuming that the US and China won't go to war because they're fighting over a... Kieran Skinner, by the way, didn't last very long in the State Department after that.
Nobody does
After,
that.
no, but after that comment. So my question here is this: how does the fact that even Trump is indulging in civilizational talk, how does the relationship that is basically the big ticket item in international relations nowadays, the US-China relationship, how does that develop over the next 2 or 3 years in the light of the kinds of empirical background that you've given us? I mean, can we draw any insights about how this will go in the next few years? I mean, because I think that what I think is great about this presentation tonight is a think tank, which my wife once read a book where she said, think tanks don't think. Basically, they're the second-hand producers of ideas. What you're doing here at DOG is you're dealing with really big ideas, which is unusual for a think tank, and I think that's really nice. But what think tankers normally want to know about is what it means for the next 2 or 3 years. And so my last cheap question to you is, what are the implications of this for big-ticket items in international relations? Not just the US-China relationship, but these kinds of things. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So you want to respond immediately, and then we can open the discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, for your generous response. The two questions you raised, the first one is how important is this geocultural fault line that may be running through the world, or perhaps the peaceful coexistence based on mutual respect for each other's value systems, which in many cases are thousands of years old, by the way. I think my students would say not very important at all. For them, the only issue in town is climate change. I said this today at the panel discussion. We were talking about the Eastern Neighborhood Policy, the South China Seas and things of this kind. And I said, heresy, if you were having this conversation in one of my classes, the students would say, what has this got to do with our future and the future of the world? So unless the civilizational discourse can actually show that there is a connection between that and the global commons, the idea that there are in fact public goods, though we may find new ones, the fact that I think civilizations have managed to identify human wrongs, like slavery, over the years, over the centuries, even though they haven't yet identified human rights, and to what extent rights are universal, because every civilization would say we have rights, of course, which in many ways essentially is old. Human wrongs are, I think, quite an achievement to have discovered what those actually are. Of course, it doesn't help if you realize that there are 27 million slaves in the world today, and that's the largest number of slaves actually in history, according to the United Nations, and that slavery takes different forms such as human trafficking, bond labor in South Asia, etc., etc. Yes, unfortunately, wrongs find a way of reinventing themselves because people like doing wrong things. They make a lot of money out of it. But the big debate, I think, is the human factor. And it's a point that Amita Ghosh, the Indian writer, says, that we mustn't allow the civilizational dialogue to detract from what is most important, which is the human, which is the commonality of the human species. And whether the civilizational dialogue can contribute to that commonality by pointing out, for example, the way in which non-Western histories have been airbrushed out of the historical account in the last 200 years, the way in which, if you're Martin Jakes, of course, who takes a particular view of China, he calls the Enlightenment Euro-provincialism of the worst kind, that may in fact be a contribution by reminding Westerners of their real place in the system, which is not at the apex of the triangle, but as part of a larger dialogue. Now, the second point about China and the United States, well, perhaps civilization is the key. I said in my book, The Improbable State, that the reason there wouldn't be a war between the United States and China, I said there's a 50-50 chance, is that the Chinese will take away the American option of going to war, which is a very Chinese response. It's the Sun Tzuian response. As Henry Kissinger says in his book on China, who would have thought that a country in the 21st century would still be reading a book that was written 2,000 years ago? Well, the fact is that Sun Tzu is very Chinese in his thinking. And winning a war without firing a shot is a very good way to win a war. Denying expeditionary power that needs coalitions and allies, because that's the only way it can do war, allies, by removing them from buying them off, essentially, ensuring that the American bases are no longer there, getting the secrets of the F-35 from day one, the most expensive weapon system in history, which makes the F-35 a very, very dubious plane in any war between the United States and China. That's a very Chinese strategy. And it's perhaps a way of keeping the peace, denying the superior military power the chance to go to war, which requires you to sit down and talk non-war options. That's civilization for you. That's why Sun Tzu is still important. It's not the way that Westerners tend to think. And there is a difference in this thought process. And there's a great book by Nisbet, I think, which is called The Geography of Thought, which explains that different civilizations, different societies, let's not call them civilizations, do actually think about problems in a very different way. And we're just getting used to that reality. That's something that was politically incorrect to say 10 or 15 years ago, but many, many people are now writing books on this subject because it's a reality. It's not necessarily a bad reality, and it requires you to have a greater knowledge of the societies you're dealing with than we did before, which is also a good thing. Knowing more about people is one way of keeping peace. That's just a quick response to your two questions.
Thank you. I think we will now open the floor, and I think it's extremely interesting to see this sort of either tension or dilemma between the universal perspective and also, let's say, the local or the civilization or the national. And I think it's very striking to see that there is very little debate today and about it. I mean, as Richard has mentioned, there are a few think tanks that are, but evidently this is at the very heart of, let's say, the world that we are heading to or building is really how to combine this global aspiration and this local also aspiration and how to make it compatible. And also in a way is what is keeping us all together today. And I think, the debate will probably, contribute ideas, and maybe some people would say, well, we have, for instance, one sort of compass that could be eventually the SDGs, which is one of the very tools that, bring the whole international community all together. I think it's also very interesting to look at this notion of universal values versus the shared values, or to reinvent, or at least to open the discussion, because we feel that today on one side you have the, let's say, the old world that is very much entrenched and on this notion of universal values, and obviously another part which is doesn't exist anymore. So I think there are plenty of major issues on the table, and this is the topic for discussion tonight. So maybe we can ask, Professor Malashenko to react from a Moscow perspective, and then we will take a few questions and comments here in the room.
Thank you so much. Yes? Do you hear me?
Yeah.
We cannot hear you well, but we will probably fix this.
And that's okay now?
Yeah, that's okay. We hear you very well now.
Okay. So I have a very brief questions. Question number one, you show the map. And following this map, Turkey and Kazakhstan belong to the West. It's true or not? Second question, you mentioned, you pronounced that Western political civilization is in trouble. And what about political civilization of China and Russia? The next question, don't you think, or you think, you approve it, that so-called civilization state like China and Russia are successful now? And what about their future? Because let's imagine that China will have an I'm sure that in the future, Chinese will have some problems in economic field, in political field. How, in that case, do you appreciate the sense of civilization state? And the last, perhaps it's a provocative some question, but at the moment we speak a lot about Islamic State. Islamic State, just it doesn't mean Daesh, but it means in general Islamic State. If it exists, if it emerges once again, how do you appreciate it? It's a civilization state or something else, or it will be something artificial, because before you talk a lot in the very broad frames, but we need in that case some more concrete. These are some of my questions.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, apologies about the map. I struggled to take Russia out of the map, and I had difficulty. This map, however, did perhaps express the hopes of some people in the West in the 1990s, particularly in the Yeltsin years, that Russia was going to join the West. Richard Nixon went to his death, I think in 1998, saying, who lost Russia? Of course, this is a ridiculous question. Russia was never there to be won, but that was a view of many Western politicians at the time. On Islamic State, yes, this Islamic State is, or was the attempt to create a civilizational state, the Caliphate, which is based on the idea that the nation state is blasphemous. The nation state is un-Islamic. This, of course, was the same argument used against Pan-Arabism in the late 50s and 60s, that Pan-Arabism was blasphemous. It was creating false consciousness, that there was unity within the Islamic world and the need to go back to the great days of the Caliphate. The difference between Al-Qaeda and ISIS was, I think, that for bin Laden and those of his persuasion, the Caliphate was always an aspiration which would never actually be realized. But it was a very important aspiration nonetheless, whereas ISIS did want to realize the Caliphate and did, in fact, create one, which, of course, was its undoing in the end. On the West and political civilization, I think the important thing here was that the West found itself in the 20th century fighting two societies that had two different social imaginaries. One was the Soviet social imaginary, which was based on the principle of class. The other was the Nazi social imaginary, which was based on the principle of race. There were people who wanted to recreate NATO as an organization that had a common enemy in Islamic fundamentalism. That was the wish of one of its Secretary Generals after the end of the Cold War. Didn't go very far. That would have been yet another universal enemy, but this time a religious enemy, a society or a state that put religion at the heart of its political discourse. So I think that the West was an attempt to realize these principles of market capitalism, which was meant to be universal, of course, freedom, the fight for freedom, which then became the fight for democracy to make the world safer democracy, which was meant to be universal, with the hope that this political civilization would become the world eventually, or at least the new world order would be one which encapsulated Western values, which would become universal values. That aspiration is at an end. As we heard Macron saying today, NATO is brain dead, at least it's in trouble, partly because its mission, its mandate, is not as clear, perhaps, as it was. And you mentioned the success stories of China and Russia. Are those attributable to the civilization state? Well, in the case of China, they are attributable, I think, to a political culture and an economic system, which is basically capitalist but different from, of course, Western capitalism. And I would say, at the end of the day, and I think Richard actually says it, I'm quoting him from his excellent paper here, it's not a clash of civilizations we're heading towards, it's a clash of political cultures and a clash of economic models. And that these are going to vie for the soul of the world. And if China continues to be successful, and if Russia succeeds in its attempts at economic reform, then yes, our model in the West will be a difficult one to sell to people outside the Western world. Everything is to play for. That's where I think we're heading now. It doesn't have to be a military conflict, far from it, but I think it will be a contestation between cultures and economic models, not economic systems, because capitalism seems to be the only system in the world at the moment. This may not be the case in the future, but it's certainly the case today. There is no alternative to capitalism being offered by any major power anywhere, but there are alternative versions of capitalism which are being offered.
Okay, so we will open the floor. We take 2 questions, so please, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. 3 simple questions. Thank you very much for your.
Can take the microphone. Take the mic. Yeah.
My name is Klaus Offe, Hertie School. 3 questions. One is the macro picture you drew is very parallel to what we in the West are studying under the name of ethno-nationalist populism and the new rightist movements with authoritarian inclinations. So you could translate the idea of socialism or whatever it is with Chinese characteristics. You get parallel formulations by Mr. Orban, democracy with Hungarian characteristics, right? So it's of one piece. The second question is, what kind of conflict do you anticipate as resulting out of this configuration? What do you do with Hong Kong and the current conflicts that are going on in conflict in Hong Kong and possible major military as well as non-military political conflicts? And the third question is, if you speak of civilization, there is a very closely connected concept, namely that of civility. And I think of Norbert Elias' work, civility meaning non-violent settlement of conflict, refinement of manners, and so on. Is this a potential common denominator of these divergent civilizations, or is it going to die in the process? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, can you give them microphone? Thank you.
Berthold Kuhn, DOC advisor, FU Berlin, and former professor at the Tsinghua and the Xiamen University in China. I would like to give you 3 examples how discourses, policies of engagement in international relations and global governance, I would like to give you 3 examples how Chinese discourses, Chinese policies, and Chinese engagement in international relations contributes to global commons, to global public goods. The first is the discourse, the policy of ecological civilization, which has been written into the Chinese constitution in 2018 and ties very well into the sustainable development framework and China's very productive role in promoting the sustainable development agenda even before the Millennium Development Goals and other environmental topics. Second, it is China's engagement with global peace missions of the United Nations. China sends the highest number of troops to United Nations peacekeeping missions. And the third one, I would say, is China's contribution to the advancement of science at the global level in different fields, in different sectors. Thank you.
Can I answer that? Yeah, thank you very much for those. I was actually quoting the Chinese professor Shanghai Institute for Foreign Affairs, who said we have no concept of public goods. But here, I think he was referring to popular movements, NGOs, humanitarian organizations, global governance ones. And of course, in China, you do have a huge growth in environmental groups in particular, who are very worried about the environmental future of both China and the planet. But thank you very much for that, and I'll go away and ponder it. On the three other questions that you raised, the last one, which is about civility. Yes, and that would be the Xi Jinping's argument. He said when he addressed UNESCO in 2014, he was saying that Americanization is extremely uncivil, and he used a Cinderella metaphor here. He said it's like trying to force your foot into someone else's shoes and cutting off your toes in order to make it fit. That is not a way of conducting international affairs or a discourse between societies, that one has to get away from this idea that one shape fits all, basically. The Xi Jinping, when he was at the Dialogue of Asian Civilizations conference this year, said that harmony with difference is the same as the European Union's concept of unity and diversity, and these two concepts match each other. But again, this was an implicit criticism of the United States for saying it doesn't have this civility idea of coexistence. Peaceful coexistence in the sense of not going to war, which is about what coexistence was in the Cold War, but not actually engaging in what you would be saying about public goods, having a different, not different concept of public goods, but shared public goods. What Nye was actually talking about, sharing public goods. Your second question, which is about, if I can read my own writing, ethno-nationalism. Yes, it is. I'm afraid to say that ethno-nationalism is growing, both within Europe and outside. Socialism with Chinese characteristics, yes, does carry the negative connotation. For example, I think in 1968, during the Czech uprising, the Prague Spring, Dubček coined another term, which was socialism with a human face. And that's quite different, socialism with a human face, than socialism with Czech characteristics. Yes, it's universalism again, but then communism was meant to be a universal philosophy, so that perhaps came easier. But I go back to the humanity element here. The human is the most important. And the civilizational discourse has to contribute to the human, but it could easily detract from the human. And the worst case of all, I think, would be India, where Narendra Modi wants to create basically a Hindu fundamentalist state, which goes completely against, A, the history of India, which has a cultural or social diversity, which is, I think, unparalleled anywhere else, the languages it speaks, the religions, etc. But secondly, it simply goes against the reality of Indian history. There is a term now which is used by Modi's supporters called negationism, which is similar in many ways to, say, climate change denial. The negationism is saying that the Hindu-Muslim dialogue of 7 centuries was not real, but it was real. And one of the examples, for example, is intermarriage between Muslims and Hindus, particularly Rajputs, which was so great within the Mughal royal family, but the last Mughal emperor, last famous Mughal emperor Aurangzeb, who was considered to be a Muslim fundamentalist, which I think is not entirely an accurate description of him, but he was certainly very Muslim. He was basically a Rajput by that stage, rather than a Mughal, hence the intermarriage in his family. There is a British historian who's written history books about this. His books are condemned for negationism, for being negative about Hindu India. If you go to the Museum of History, Cultural Museum in Delhi, you'll find that the Mughal period has been largely disappeared. It's no longer there or celebrated. Well, Mughal India was one of the great moments in Indian history. A Persian moment as well. the interface between Persian civilization and Indian civilization, which continued right into the mid-18th century, was extraordinary and is a feature of Indian history, one to be celebrated, not one to be condemned. And your last question was, which I've forgotten now, is about conflict. Hong Kong. Well, again, two systems, one country. That model, which is meant, was enshrined in the 1997 treaty. I don't know what's going to happen in Hong Kong, whether there will be a crackdown at the end of the year, or whether there will be marginalization of Hong Kong economically and politically, or whether there will just be a kind of creeping regime of punishing the dissenters. But the really dangerous thing is that there is a crackdown, and that's the end of the two systems, one country, which means that that will no longer be on offer to Taiwan as a way of reconciling Taiwan to full membership of China, at least as a transitional stage to full membership of China. And then the alternative is what? Invasion, war, annexation, or just an acceptance of the status quo. And I think acceptance of the status quo is not viable for the Communist Party in China. So I do feel concerned about that. What happens in Hong Kong is important in the larger context, not just of Chinese politics.
Okay, we'll take one or two other questions. Yes?
Thank you so much. My name is Vladimir Popov. I work here in the Institute of Dialogue of Civilizations. The way you define the civilization state, the state that proclaims itself as the one that is a particular civilization or thinks about itself as a particular civilization, I think this is something which is not really new. In history, all the states were civilization states. You know, I'm not going to, to Roman Empire or Byzantine or, Arab Caliphate is a typical civilization states, but all the states, Charlemagne, yes, the Alexander the Great, right, was trying to civilize the rest of the world. It was a civilization state. In fact, if there is a trend, then it's a trend to go away from civilization state, because in the 20th century, there were at least two states that were based not on civilization, but on ideology. The Soviet Union, of course, is the prime example. It's international brotherhood of all people, of labor. It is not nationality, it is not particular civilization. And the United States is the other example. It's the state which is based on the idea of freedom and liberty, right? So what do you think would be the future? Where do you see the rise of civilization state? It seems like in history it was always the case. It's difficult to find a state that was not a civilization state. And if we go somewhere, we go to elimination of all the borders and to international principles. And in the 25th century, Star Trek, right? When all the nationalities are going on one spaceship. There's definitely one civilization for the human race. Thank you.
Yes, well, of course, the Klingons call the Federation in Star Trek a humans-only club. They're very dismissive of it. I don't agree with you on that point. I don't think England called itself civilization state in the 15th or 16th centuries. It was part of a larger entity called Christendom, which the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 became Europe for the first time. And then Europe in the 19th century, I think, discovered something called Western civilization, which is very, very important. And I say for the first time, because the first time it's, well, first of all, there is no word civilization in European languages until the French coined it in the 1750s. And the first time it is used politically is by Napoleon when he invades Egypt in 1798, which is the beginning of that phase of Western intervention in the Middle East, where he says, gentlemen, we're introducing the Egyptians to civilization. And what he meant by that is we're introducing them to the European Enlightenment, basically, and we are at the apex of this triangle. And that was of course, a Western idea. So I don't entirely agree with you, and I think although the Greeks and Alexander the Great and Hellenism and trying to match Persian and Greek civilization, which lasted only as long as his lifetime, that was immediately abandoned, and you had Greek elites running the Eastern world. I don't think they thought of themselves in terms of civilization. But look, we can disagree on that point. I think what you are right to say is that in the 20th century, the concept of a civilization state was perhaps set aside by elements of class, but this was a universal understanding, or race, which was extremely important, that the world was divided into racial divisions rather than civilizational divisions. Perhaps those civilizations and race coincided, but they didn't always coincide. There was, interestingly, an attempt, as you know, in the 1930s to create a Soviet civilization. There were lots of talk in Moscow about, is there a specifically Soviet civilization with a Soviet science, and Soviet history, and Soviet culture, which didn't really go very far. And Imperial Japan, undoubtedly, in the 1930s, the debate there was, how can Japan survive in a piranha tank of nation states if it can't fall back on what makes it so distinctively un-Western and un-Chinese, because these were the two, of course, countries or entities against which Japan had to measure itself as being different. And there was a famous debate in 1943 into the Second World War at Kyoto, a famous Kyoto dialogue about what made Japan un-Western. And for the first time, I think these civilizational aspects came into the discussion. But I'll have to leave it at there.
Can we get back to this issue about universal values? And because obviously this is a debate that is getting more and more traction. There is no real open discussion about it, and you know, it was taken for granted that those universal values was adopted. I mean, in the aftermath of World War II, and that they were truly universal. Now there is a rising call to say this was not really truly universal. You know, this was adopted at a time where the Western world and the Western values were predominantly imposing their views, and that when the UN Declaration was adopted, there were 48 member states. You know, because most of the African countries, for instance, were under either the Brits or the French, you know, the domination. And how do you see this debate evolving? You know, that do you think that we will really reopen, let's say, the Pandora box, and you know, reconsider those sort of charter that were adopted and that we saw that would be intangible for the rest of the world? How can we expect the debate to evolve? And I think I was very intrigued by what you said about the human rights versus the human wrongs, and which, you know, because when we look at universal values, you know, there is obviously a distinction to be made between what we could call the values and what we could call eventually the human progress. So what is really something that is common regardless culture and civilization, which, you know, in terms of universal principle can be, of course, I mean, could be considered as human progress, and that will not be under attack, and others that, I think that, you know, it's very confused now, and I think it would be interesting to get your views, and this is also something that DOC maybe also put on its agenda in the near future, because there is a need for informal discussion among the different cultures.
Right. Well, first of all, when I was talking about human wrongs, I was citing a British philosopher, very late Mary Midgley, who died, I think, earlier this year. She shows an interesting example. In Imperial Japan, until the end of the 17th century, if you were a samurai and you met someone at a crossroads, you were entitled to practice your swordsmanship. Swordsmanship often took up to 20 years to perfect, by decapitating anyone you came across at a crossroads, provided they were they were not samurai themselves. And then at the end of the 17th century, it was decided that that actually wasn't very correct in terms of the civilizing process, that this kind of whimsical, capricious use of violence was actually somewhat uncivilized. And so they practiced their swordsmanship on criminals in jails, in prisons. The point I think Midgley was making was that the progress towards human wrongs is a different story from the progress towards human rights. The progress towards human rights, as we understand it, is contractual, is founded in a group of philosophies that derive from largely from Europe or Judeo-Christianity, which anchor this debate in the Western world. You can go back 2,000 years, you can go back to the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the rights of man being the first ever document to actually talk about human rights in this sense. The rights of man being, of course, if you look at the document fully, the title is The Rights of Man and the Citizen, because the concept of the French revolutionaries was that you only had rights if you were a citizen. Subjects did not have rights. That's monarchies were tyrannous and had to be abolished for that reason. So that is a very specific discourse to early 19th century Europe. The other point I would say is made by Kwame Appiah, the Harvard professor who writes on ethics, where he was looking at a series of wrongs. The first chapter is on foot binding in China. And his whole argument in that chapter was the foot binding didn't come to an end because of Protestant missionaries coming in and saying it was wrong, or European diplomats saying that this was a terrible, uncivilized process. It was entirely an internal debate. And essentially, Appiah was showing other examples in which the victory of human rights in the course of the 20th century was often generated by internal debates that had nothing to do with trying to be like Westerners or listening to what Westerners had to actually say. So that, I think, is itself very important, that we rewrite this history of human rights to show that it is not a specifically Western dialogue. The other point you mentioned is where do we go from here? Well, it is a big shock for the Europeans, is it not? I mean, it was Heidegger in the 1930s, not that long ago, who wrote an essay in which he said it's terrible that the whole world is becoming westernized because once it does, we'll have no one to talk to. That we only know our identity by identifying our differences from other people. That's what makes us Germans or Europeans or Chinese. And soon, if we have a world in which no one can actually have a conversation with each other, because it's just an internal dialogue, then that will be a tragedy historically. Well, anyway, one should never mention Heidegger in any circumstances, I suppose, but I mention him here just to show it wasn't that long ago. It wasn't so long ago that in French schools, history books were telling French school children that the Algerians only became aware that they were human beings, not necessarily human beings with rights or without rights, but human beings thanks to French colonialism. That it was French colonialism that had restored their humanity or given them their humanity by being part of this larger community of rights and discourses. That, in a sense, was the civilizing mission. I don't know how we do this. The big debate in China at the moment is over ethno-nationalism in Tibet, which is getting worse, by the way, and with the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs, and the fate of the Uyghurs. And it is deafening that the Islamic world, which one of them imagined would have had an interest in this subject, has said absolutely nothing. Only 2 countries have expressed misgivings, Malaysia and Indonesia. And they've done so on the understanding that this is going to create a new generation of young, radicalized Muslims who will be so shocked by what's been happening in Asia, not in the Middle East or not in Europe or anywhere else, that they will join the next generation of terrorists, and that this is breeding a terrorism problem for Asia. Asia has a terrorism problem, but they think historically this will put the terrorism problem the West has in the shade. So where do we start with that? Do Uyghurs have human rights? Is religion, the rights to express your religion, a right? Because the oppression of the Uyghurs is based entirely on ethno-nationalism. That it's, again, to use the term I've used before, false consciousness. You can't really be a Muslim and Chinese at the same time, which, of course, is against Chinese history. And this is why I talked about the valorization of history, though I didn't use the term, but it was on the whose history are we talking about? And what version of history are we talking about? And history is much more complex, multicultural, and interesting because of its diversity and its complexity. But in the attempt to create a single civilizational dialogue of history, we're in danger of losing sight of that fact. How do we start this debate? And that's for you to decide, because you're the institute. My job is to identify problems, not to come up with solutions, because it's beyond me intellectually, and anyway I would charge if I did have solutions to these problems. But this is perhaps the solutions come from the enterprise itself. They don't come before the enterprise. You don't come with the answers already. They have to emerge. But for that, there has to be a degree of frankness.
Thank you. Thank you. If there is no... there is one other question. The microphone is coming. Here. Stefan Borger. No, it's not you? Sorry, it's you. Oh, well, sorry.
Hello. Yes. You mentioned that there was a recent statement that someone had declared that NATO was brain dead and possibly on life support. And thought I would ask you to respond to a statement that General Petraeus said when he was talking about NATO, and he said that one thing has breathed life back into NATO, and his name is Vladimir Putin. I was wondering if you might have a response on that.
Well, that's a question perhaps better directed at the conference I was at earlier this morning. It was Macron who said this in his interview with The Economist, but he'd also tweeted it before a few days ago. Look, does NATO represent the West, I suppose, is a question. You remember that NATO in the 1990s wanted to go global. It had 42 partnerships. It does have 42 partnerships with different countries. It invited countries like Japan and Australia to have observer status, which they have today. And it still, I think, sees itself as global. I remember George Robertson, who was the NATO Secretary General at the time, saying, "I'm the global policeman on the beat. You know, this is what I do." Well, that's all a long time ago, and I think we've moved from that discourse, to use that academic term, to another one. But no, I don't think that NATO is the West. What I would say is that this political civilization I talked about, or what Donald Tusk talked about, did institutionalize itself at certain points, particularly in the Cold War, and became, to a large extent, NATO. That's what the West meant. And the West didn't mean Australia or Canada, didn't mean Japan. These countries were either in the West or Western or of the West, but they were not part of this political civilization. They were not members of the institutions of that political civilization. I suppose the big issue, I'll end on that note because I know we have to end, is what Putin said the other day, that the G7 should be abolished because the G7 is now a Western institution and represents what is left of this political civilization, and yet speaks for the world economically. The G20 is another organization, of course, which is trying to make up the difference. So I think the future of these institutions will, of course, be much discussed in the years to come.
Thank you, Professor Cocker, for this very stimulating discussion, and also to help us to navigate the labyrinths of the complexity of the new world order, or the world in the making. And I also take up your offer, you know, that we would be working together, that you would provide the knowledge, and we would provide eventually some element of response. And I think this is the way we can work together. And evidently, there is a rising debate that is extremely sometimes complex or confused. I was just in Beijing a few days ago with and I was kind of very intrigued or amazed to see that at a time where China is kind of claiming its traditional values and also trying to make that the TV program more Chinese and less westernized, and that you see that it's the over-domination of the Western brands, and particularly luxury brands, and which is really the symbol of the, let's say, the Western values. And so there is lots of, in a way, contradiction and lots of tensions, and it's very interesting to see how this would lead us. And I think it is very important to have this kind of conversation tonight, where evidently we tremendously benefit from your analysis, observation, and where we can also, through the dialogue that we are providing, you know, trying to clarify, and also, as we said before, our mission is really to see how to, you know, to provoke a debate that will be non-confrontational, but with a constructive spirit, you know, to try to go towards some sort of common ground. So it's maybe for some it's very naive or very cheesy, but it's in a way quite kind of indispensable. So thanks a lot again for your presence. I think we we can really express our gratitude. And my last word before, inviting you for a drink now is to say that our next lecture will be certainly also extremely interesting and stimulating. On November 26th, we will have Bruno Macaes, who is a former Minister of European Affairs in Portugal, and who just wrote an extremely also stimulating book that is called The Dawn of Eurasia, and which is evidently a new sort of not just geo-economic but also geopolitical new region in the making. And so we will try to to decipher what's happening and where we are heading with this notion of Eurasia. So you are most welcome to to join on November 26th. Once again, thanks a lot, and let's have a refreshment.
Would it be possible to take away?
You want several or
No,
just
just the one. Thank you very much. That'd be very, very useful. Thank you very much. That was very useful. I will take that into board. Yeah. And the ecological one, is that written into Constitution, did you say? The ecology?
What's written into the Chinese Constitution?
Chinese
and it's on the
Constitution.
present. I mean,